folks, I'm in the 140 today and I want to talk to you about the first of our upgrades to the 140 to get it a little bit closer to the M4 in the way it drives and behaves, and what I consider to be an absolute must-have for these cars. My advice to anyone that's thinking about buying a 135 or a 140 is, if you've got a budget of say 14 grand, buy a car for 12 and have 2 grand aside for the diff. For me, they're just not a proper rear wheel drive car, not a proper BMW without the diff. So that's exactly what I did when I bought mine. I looked at cars that gave me enough scope in my budget to get a diff fitted, and I got one fitted by a chap called Dave Welsh in Liverpool. I thoroughly recommend Dave. I know quite a few people that have had Quaifes in particular fitted by him, and his service is second to none. He gets everything sorted. He gets the crown wheel and the diff. He gets that machined before you go to him. He gets it all installed in a diff casing and then does it on an exchange basis whilst you're there. Cost wise, give Dave a message, but it's normally about the cheapest place that you can get it done, and he favours the Quaife unit. So why did I go for the Quaife over the M Performance diff? To be honest, there's very, very little in them. It seems that they behave extremely similarly, and my take on it is that the weakest link when it comes to the way that the car drives and behaves, particularly on the limit, particularly sliding around, is the squidgy bit behind the wheel. I'm definitely the weak link. The diff doesn't matter. You know, you put Chris Harris in the car, anything with a Quaife will slide around all day long. Anything with an M Performance diff will do exactly the same. The guy behind the wheel is what matters, not whether it's got a BMW diff or a Quaife one. So for me, the fact that the Quaife is a complete fit and forget is what makes it the preference for me. I don't really hear of anybody having to have the BMW one serviced, so that might be a stretch. A few years down the line, there might be a few that pop up. So that's why I went for the Quaife, but to be perfectly honest, if a BMW one comes up at the right price, have that one instead. So what does the diff do? Well, I'm not going to go into how an LSD works, but the fundamentals of it are that you get both rear wheels turning at about the same rate, and they drive you through and out of a corner together, rather than one wheel getting a much larger proportion of the drive or all of the drive. More importantly, how does it feel? Well, you feel it almost all the time when you drive one of these cars, and that's why I consider it to be an absolute must-have. It's very difficult to explain, but it just makes the car feel like a proper rear-wheel drive car. When you squeeze the accelerator, when you're coming out of a corner, it pushes you round the corner like a rear-wheel drive car should do. When you first have it installed, or at least when I first had mine installed, I noticed that I had just a little bit too much steering lock on when I was cornering on throttle, and it just tightens the line very, very subtly, but it just feels magic. Of course, when beyond the limits and at the limit, it behaves much more, pardon the word, it behaves much more organically with the diff in. It's more predictable. It sort of transitions into a slide much nicer. Coming out of junctions, it's easier to have more fun with it. Did I notice the Sport Plus setting let me have any more fun? I'm not sure I did, you know. I think it's still pretty much the same as it is with the E-diff. It's just easier to play with, and it feels nicer. It feels more natural for the car. Do I go drifting it all over shop? No. But it's good fun when there's low grip conditions or you're at the track. It behaves much nicer, and it feels easier going into oversteer. It feels like you understand what the car's doing better and how it reacts better to your throttle input. So you're not going to be drifting the car every time you get in the driver's seat, or at least I hope you're not, unless you live next door to a track. But you will almost definitely feel the diff every time you drive the car. It just feels proper. It feels sweet. When you get on that throttle on the exit of a corner, you sort of feel like both of the wheels at the back are pushing you around the corner, rather than the car sitting on one wheel and that sort of doing some sort of weird open diff thing. I'm really poor at explaining this, but it just feels right with the diff. So take my word for it. It's a lot of money, but it's absolutely worth the money without a shadow of a doubt. I happily paid the premium, and I would pay it again without a shadow of a doubt. If you budget in for one of these, make sure you get the diff. Also, we'll come on to this next time, make sure you've got enough for some proper suspension as well. So does it turn it into an M car? Categorically no, it doesn't. It turns it into a 140 with a diff. It doesn't turn it into an M car. The M car, the way the M car behaves is because the whole car is that much more sharper, and it's built, the chassis of the car is built to go around the racetrack. It's built to be dynamic and react to your inputs instantaneously. This car will probably never have those things, but it just means that the car drives as a rear-wheel drive car should, and when it does go into oversteer, it does so in a much more natural, progressive manner. Why do they cost so much in these cars? So I think it was perhaps the generation before. It might have been the old 135i coupe, or it might have been the F20s onwards. I'm not actually sure. But around about 2010, something like that, BMW started to make the crown wheel part of the diff, or at least it was welded to the diff or something like that. And it meant that you can't simply swap the crown wheel onto a new diff unit. So in other cars, you just take off the crown wheel. It's normally on bolts, and you normally just unbolt it, take out the old open unit, pop a slippy diff in there, and then you get it set up. The setup's actually quite tricky, or at least requires some specialism, but the actual physical act of taking the crown wheel off and putting the new diff in is very, very simple. But with these new welded units, a few years old now, but with the newer welded units, it requires some machining to get the crown wheel off before you can mount it to a new diff. So it does mean there's obviously time. They need a complete unit to get the crown wheel off before they can fit the new Quaife unit to the crown wheel, and so it just makes the whole process more complicated, more time consuming, and therefore more costly. So where you might expect to get a diff in your car, something like a Quaife or comparable, into another car for say £1,000, in these cars sadly it's more like £2,000. What about some of the posher units? The Wave Track is an interesting unit in that it's a torque biasing diff, but avoids that sort of zero traction on one wheel with one wheel in the air. They're really interesting. I'd be interested to drive a Wave Track. And then of course you've got the sort of the posher clutch type diffs, which I'm sure are fantastic. I'd love to drive a car with like an OS Jicken or Gicken Super LSD. I bet they feel spectacular at the track. But like I said earlier, the weak link is almost always the driver. So the Quaife, we know, does a great job. It feels lovely with the power, the torque of these cars. So my recommendation, don't worry about what sort of diff it is, just get a diff in there.